I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Just what do you think you're doing, Dave?
Why, you stuck-up, half-witted, scruffy-looking nerf herder.
This means something.
I am Locutus of Borg.
I must not fear, and fear is the mind killer.
Get away from her, you
Nerd! Nerd!
I'm Matt Kressel.
And I'm David Mercurio Rivera.
And
this is
Nerd Count.
Welcome to episode 2 of the Nerd Count podcast. Today we're going to be talking about pantsing versus plotting, outlining versus writing by the seat of your pants. I'm Matthew Kressel, and I co-host a series here with
Mercurio D. Rivera, also known for simplicity's sake as David. And I wanted to say that the topic that we're discussing today is something that's addressed in Matt's recent book, Dispatches from the Outer Deep.
We're already doing plugs.
A little guidebook on writing tips and submitting stories.
I didn't pay him for that.
Long or short fiction, which is a and but one of the chapters in that guidebook talks about these two different approaches to writing stories, which is, as Matt said, outlining versus kind of free flow writing, and it's a hotly debated topic among writers. As long as we've been writing, we've been arguing about this. So we thought we'd share that argument with you folks. So what are the differences between the two approaches, Matt? What is pantsing, as you call it?
Yeah, so I think that's a good place to start. It's just definitions, right? So when we're talking about pantsing, we're talking about, writing by the seat of your pants. And what does this mean, writing by the seat of your pants? What does that mean? Well, I think what it means, and obviously definitions are slippery, but I think what it means is that you sort of just start with an idea and then you keep writing and see where that idea takes you. You might have an end goal in mind, you might not. You might just follow your id, so to speak, follow where your ideas take you and not be as concerned with hitting every beat, every plot point, not so worried about where everything's going to end up. You might have a general destination in mind, but not necessarily. And that is one method of writing, and I know plenty of people that write that way. And then there's the other method that a lot of people use, which is outlining. Now, Dave, you outline a lot. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, I mean, there is a kind of a strict definition of an outline where you sit down and you do Roman numeral 1A and then subsection 1 and subsection 2, and that's not what I mean when I say outline. When I outline my stories, what I do is I usually have 3 or 4 bullet points that describe a scene in the story. And most short stories don't have that many scenes. You might have 4 or 5 scenes max. So basically, and I'll just have a bullet point that says where are things happening, who's in the scene, and what happens in that scene. And usually it's 2 sentences, so it'll be half a page, literally 3 or 4 bullet points, and that's it. That's my outline to begin. And the idea is, by outlining it, it gives me direction. When I sit down to write a story, I know where I'm going. I know where the scene's going to end. I know where the next scene's going to start, and it gives me purpose when I sit down to write the story.
Have you ever written a story where you did not outline?
I have, and what I'll do is, what I find is that I'll write myself into a corner oftentimes. I'll just, if I just kind of free flow and just start writing, I'll reach a point where I don't know where I'm going, and I'm in an impossible corner that I can't get out of. So then I'll switch back to the outline. And by the way, a good example of, I'll take that back. There is one example of free flowing that I thought helped, that I thought worked, which is when we did our recent collaboration. Mm-hmm. We did a collaboration, and you forced me off the outline.
I did.
You did. You're like, no, we're not outlining. Just write the next scene, and it resulted in some really cool twists. So it just goes to show that there are benefits and drawbacks to both approaches. But
Every time I gave you a scene, you had the characters take their clothes off. No, I'm just kidding.
yeah, I don't know.
Really interesting twist there, Dave.
But I guess we should mention that. I mean, I just let the listeners know that Matt and I worked on a novella recently, a collaboration where we, it was a kind of a sprawling science fiction novella, and we would take turns writing scenes. Matt wrote the opening scene, then I wrote the second scene, and went back and revised the first scene, and then Matt wrote the third scene and revised the first two scenes, and back and forth. By the time we finished, we both felt we had written the whole story, which is a good sign of a successful collaboration, I think.
I think it's a really great story. I hope it sees the light of day. It has been provisionally accepted by a large market, let's say. We're just waiting for the contract. It's been a while. That's a whole other story. But it is a fantastic story I'm very proud of. I think you're proud of it too, right? And
no,
yeah.
No, I'm proud of it. It's a great story, and like I said, part of it was you forced me off the outline just to change my usual approach, so it resulted in some really cool twists that I didn't anticipate. It just kind of came about as a result of taking a more free flow approach.
So I wanted to talk a little bit. So you're saying like when you're pantsing, writing by the seat of your pants, which is, by the way, there are different terms for these. So I think George R. R. Martin calls them weeders versus gardeners. So the gardener is the one is the outliner, the plotter, right? And the weeder is the pantser. So the weeder is just sort of going through the garden, pulling out the bad stuff, whereas the gardener is intentionally planting stuff. So I think depending on who you ask, there's different terms for this. But just in terms of my experience with these two methods, I used to just only pants. Like I would have a general idea where I was going, and just sit down and write. And just like you said, I wrote myself into corners. And then what happens is you get into a situation where you're like, well, how do I get this character out of this? And then you end up with some really weird and convoluted explanation, and it may work sort of like in a weird way, but then when readers come across it, they're like, yeah, that was kind of weird. It seemed out of character, or that came out of the blue. Or if you know the expression Deus ex machina, it seems as if like, they just got really lucky at the end and pulled into the situation that didn't seem to flow naturally from the text. So I think that could be a risk of pantsing. But I also feel that sometimes, like you just said, Dave, when you're working with a piece and you would just sort of allow it to evolve on its own, sometimes you get to really interesting places. How do you feel about it?
I think that's fair. And I think another advantage of pantsing is, and one of the strengths of your stories is character. I think that because you're focused on character and you're very true to your character, that I think that the pantsing method facilitates that, making strong characters. But I think the weakness, in my opinion, is that sometimes your plot goes awry. And the converse is true as well. When I'm outlining, a criticism I will get of my first drafts is, well, I don't really believe that your character did this, or your character, I don't understand your character, or I don't like your character.
Yeah.
Because they're going through the motions of hitting the outline points. That's when it's not working, and that's when I got to go back and revise things. So I think that's an advantage and disadvantage.
Yeah, and I tend these days to do more of a hybrid model. So the first story that I ever outlined, I think, was The Sounds of Old Earth. And that one went on to win, not win, but it was a finalist for the Nebula Award.
Deserve to win.
Thank you. I think it only lost by a few votes. It made me really. I'm not bitter at all about that. But yeah, it's so that one. I actually recently bought Scrivener, which is, if you're not familiar with it, it's a a tool for authors. It really allows you to separate out chapters and do notes and everything like that. I don't really use the note-taking feature on it as much, but I do like how it separates out your chapters into like separate, I don't know if they're files, but they're just like separate sections, so I can very easily go back and forth to a chapter. It's like, oh wait, what happened back there? Okay. And so that's what I did with Sounds of Old Earth, was I just sort of did what you mentioned before, Dave, where I was like, okay, here's the scene and here's the beat, and then here's another scene and here's the beats, and then I went through and was like, oh, wow, like that really made that story land in a way that I don't know it would have landed had I not plotted it that way. But
Yeah.
conversely, I will say that so I was invited to submit to this anthology um, called the Unioverse. A bunch of game developers got together and they started this kind of shared world. There's video games, there's books and graphic novels all in this shared world. So they're like, we want you to come up with a character. And I was like, oh, awesome! I'll build this superhero from scratch. And I wrote out this kind of pitch, and then they were like, "Oh, great! Now can you present it to us over video?" And I'm like, "Wait, what?" Like it was almost like a TV pitch. I'm like, "Oh man, like I've never done this before. I'm used to like sitting in my closet and writing, not pitching it to like, you know, four former executives at video game and TV stuff." So I pitched it to them, and they were like, "Oh my God, this is so great! I love it!" Blah blah blah. So I'm like, "Oh, okay." And then I sat down to write it, and I'll tell you what happened is a lot of that stuff, like you realize in an outline that sometimes when you actually get to writing it, it either comes off as like forced or convoluted or doesn't flow with the story, or you end up like my issue was it sounded really great in the pitch, but it was really the treatment for a novel. And they were like, well, we want a short story. I'm like, oh no, how am I going to cram all this story into like 5,000 words? It ended up being like a 9,000 word story. But
Well, that's an interesting dilemma, because I mean, one of the things about outlining that I should mention is that, um, uh, and it's interesting because in your situation, you were trapped by the fact that you had already pitched the particular outline to somebody who was interested in the story. But in most cases, I will go back and I'll revise the outline. If the
yeah,
story's going in a different direction or it's changing in some way, I'll feel very comfortable going back, looking at the outline and saying, well, I'm going to switch these scenes around and add another scene here. And again, it's almost like it's a mind trick. I'm fooling myself by creating a structure that then gives me direction. But I've spoken to other writers who say, I can't write with an outline. I feel straitjacketed. I feel constrained.
hmm
I can't. I feel totally like I can't. How can you write with an outline? And and what I always say is, for goodness sakes, just change the outline if you feel constrained. That's no constraint.
yeah.
But yeah, but your situation was interesting because you really were constrained since you pitched the outline.
I had to change some things. And the other thing too was because it was a shared world, they were continually changing things as well.
Ah,
So they like, things that I had actually come up with. I was like, "Oh, I think it would be really cool if there was like an archive, like a library at this space station that people can access." And then they ended up using that, but then they changed the name and they changed how you could access it. And so I was like, I'm in the middle of writing this thing and you're pulling the rug out from under me. But it ended up. I really love that story. I hope people check it out. But
yeah. I'm thinking of other examples where I've used a hybrid type of approach as well in one of my earlier stories, Longing for Longalana, which created my Worgen universe. Worgens are these aliens who are biochemically infatuated with humans. It's a long story.
they're great
But
stories. You should check it out. The Love War, his collection or novel of Worgen stories, fantastic. Really, really great stories. But go
Oh,
ahead.
thanks, Matt. That's pitch number two that we've
All right.
that's
I'll
that we
look for the
dropped in.
Venmo later.
But in Longing for Langalana, in that particular case, I had the ending scene in mind before I sat down to write the
Right.
story. I knew where the story was going to end. I wanted the story to end with an alien staring down at a world off planet, kind of staring down, being unable to approach that world, and kind of
Great image.
wistfully reminiscing about lost love. I wanted to end with that poignant image, and then so I wrote that scene first, and then I wrote some earlier scenes about romance and first contact, which is a strange combination. And then I had these different scenes, and then I said, all right, well, now I'm starting to get lost. So I sat down, and using those scenes that I'd written, I created an outline, and then shuffled things around and created flashbacks, and it all came together. But that's an example of, again, we talk about outlining and pantsing, and really a lot of times it does turn out, at least in my case, to be a hybrid approach.
Yeah, because I think, pantsing the dangers, I think we all know the dangers. You could see it with someone like George R. R. Martin. George R. R. Martin says that he's a weeder. He doesn't outline. He just sort of writes. And you were mentioning this before. Like, his characters are fantastic. Like, few writers can approach the characterization that George Martin does. But some might say that his stories sort of sprawl, into these monstrous things, and I'm just wondering how he's going to wrap it all up and make an ending satisfying. Everyone's always going to want another book, another story. And also conversely, with outlining, I know people who were like, well, no, I need to work out the oral history of my world's 17 kingdoms and the entire magic system before I write a single word. And then they'll have like 50, 70, 80 pages of just notes, but they haven't written a single sentence of prose. And that, to me, this is just my personal take. It's like, I feel like, why not just put that, just start writing? Like, you could always change it later. Like, I don't understand. And I think some people need, like, when you're sitting down, and everybody's different in this regard, but I know when I sit down before a blank page, there's an anxiety there. I mean, it's a good anxiety. It's fun anxiety, but it's also like, okay, well, how do I start this? Where do I go with this? And I think for some people, that anxiety is overwhelming. And that's why they outline, because it gives them sort of a framework or a scaffolding to be able to build their house.
And it's also just the disguised procrastination in some ways.
It can be.
Sometimes it depends on the genre of fiction that you're writing as well. I know that if you're writing historical fiction, for example, you may want to research historical points for accuracy, but
Yeah.
I don't know if you need to write 50 pages of of notes before you begin. Maybe, I mean,
That's the thing.
I don't write that genre, but that doesn't make sense to me.
It's very easy to, look from outside and be like, oh, that's just procrastination. I don't want to generalize and say that's what everybody's doing. I do see that, though. It's like, well, I need to outline this first. I need to do this first. And to me, it's sort of like, well, just write the thing. You've been outlining for 3 years. Like, just write the thing.
Well, certainly. And also, I think it's more justified if it's a novel as opposed to, maybe we've been talking about short fiction. I think that once you get to, not that I have much experience with novels, you have more than I do, Matt, but I think that you really do need to outline before you sit down and start writing a novel. More so than for short fiction. Do you agree with that?
I agree with that 100%. And I think that the first novel that I had published, King of Shards, I did not outline. And I think that's kind of apparent, because I think the beginning of that, I love the book. I think it's a great book. But I think the first third to 50%, it's a little slow, and then it picks up at the last 50% because I'm like, oh, I got to start getting this thing moving. So I think the danger there is to not outline as much, because I didn't outline. But then with my second book, Queen of Static, excuse me, I definitely outlined, and I also had read a lot of George R. R. Martin at that point, and I was like, oh, what's his secret? How is he doing this? And I was like, oh, he ends each chapter with a cliffhanger. He has a really cool, event that happens with the character. It gives you great insight into their way of thinking and acting. And then he ends with a cliffhanger. So it's like, oh, I want to know what happens next. Oh, well, no, now we're going to another character. So you do that 4, 5, 6, 7 times. Eventually, you have all these fascinating characters that people just want to read more of. So that's kind of like the structure that I did for Queen of Static. And yeah, that was
Yeah,
fun.
yeah.
Um,
It's interesting. You mentioned George R. R. Martin.
yeah.
When you talk about outlining, I think about Game of Thrones, the
Hmm.
TV series,
Yeah.
as opposed to the books, that the writers
Sure.
were had the advantage of working from the books that were in existence and using those as an outline to give the show direction,
Hmm.
purpose, character. Then you know how the characters are going to develop, so you can plant those seeds early on in the show.
Yeah.
So this character is going to be wind up here, so we're going to start him here so that we can see that arc and see that change. So you could see that the show was fantastic, in my opinion. I mean, in my opinion, partly because they were working from an outline,
Yeah.
and then it kind of fell off the rails a little bit once they ran out of the outline, and maybe they had a new outline that they were working from, but I don't
They
know. It
they
just
went
seems
off book. No, I agree. I agree with you. As soon as they diverged from the books, the quality of the show, and I think generally people agree with this. There were some episodes that were still pretty good, but once they went off the Martin books, to me, it felt like it became more of a Hollywood blockbuster ending rather than the nuanced characterization and complexity. Like suddenly like all this beautiful complexity that Martin had built up in this sprawling world just became much smaller and narrower, and um, the characterization just got kind of very predictable, let's say. That was the thing about Game of Thrones. It was like you could never predict what was going to happen. Your beloved character could die at any moment, and I just felt like they diverged from that quite a bit.
Yeah, and I could, at least I could tell that they wanted to hit a mark. Like
Hmm.
Daenerys's arc is going to turn her to an evil, whatever, queen of the realm. So we're going to hit that mark, and I don't think that the character was, in my opinion, again towards the end, it didn't feel like it didn't feel organic to me. I mean, because it's just the point of view character we were rooting throughout. I know that there's supposed to be a sudden change where you realize, oh, we've been rooting for a bad guy all along, kind of like Breaking Bad, but it didn't seem true to the character.
No.
And maybe it's because they went off book that development didn't seem real to me at the
Well,
end.
like you said, they were trying to hit a specific point, right? So that like
Mm,
somebody somewhere was like, well, we have to have Daenerys turn evil and torch all the innocent villagers with her dragon, and you're just like, okay, how do we get her there? But at the same time, like forcing a character towards a plot point, towards a point in your outline. If that doesn't work, then you might have to abandon that, and that's both terrifying and like liberating too. So
mhm.
I just probably by the time this podcast is published, I'll be able to announce it. So I'll announce it. I sold a novel called Space Trucker Jess. And I have a confession to make is that I did not outline that book. I had general idea in my head of where I wanted each beat to go. So maybe I had like an unwritten outline in my head, but I didn't outline. I fo-
Wow,
I followed.
I had no idea, Matt. I thought that was thoroughly outlined.
No, but I knew where I wanted to end it.
Mm,
And I kind of had beats along the way, but I didn't. And what I did was just sort of follow the character. And I think there's a kind of verisimilitude with that. And I think that, I keep going back to George Martin, but you know, one of the strengths with him is he just follows the characters. He just follows it. I mean, Stephen King does this too, right?
mhm.
And you just take a character and you just like, well, okay, well, where do they go? What would they do? And instead of trying to like force them into a place or a situation that doesn't seem organic or real, let them kind of lead you along. Sometimes this ends with, you're writing yourself into a corner. I did that several times with Space Trucker Jess. I'm like, oh shit, what did I do? How do I get the character out of this? How do I fix this? Is this scene working? And then, you take a few days or a week to really think about it and like, oh, all right, I could do it this way, and then it works again.
Right.
But that is a risk. But no, I definitely sort of followed sort of, you know, uh, the
Yeah.
character there other than an outline.
Right. Another as you said, there's a risk that you might have to trash something you've written if it moves you to a place that ultimately it doesn't work. That there's some risk to that, but Jeff Ford, somebody a
Yeah.
writer who we both admire, is a big proponent of simply sitting down and having one sentence naturally follow the next, and just following the characters along a certain path until you have a story, and that's his approach. And I've tried it. I can't do it that way. I can't. You've been able to, right, Matt?
I do. I'm not like Jeff is a master at it, and he's just it's kind of amazing how he does it. And I don't know exactly what's going on in his head. I don't know if he has a general idea of where he wants to go, or he just sort of sits down and goes. But yeah, no,
Hmm.
he's able to do that. He does an outline. He just sort of follows. He says he like tries to really envision the scene in his mind and just go with it. And I've done that, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
somebody who I admire very much, who takes the opposite approach, is Terry Bisson,
Hmm.
whose fiction writing class I took at the New School a couple times. Terry passed away recently,
Yeah.
very very sadly. But he's somebody who I admired very much, and he introduced me to writing speculative fiction long ago. He had a very mechanical approach to writing short stories, and he would say, pitch the idea. What's the MacGuffin? What's the general concept at the heart of your story? Is it a time travel machine? Is it a genie? Is it whatever speculative element that is? Pitch it to me, and then he'd say, well, can you just write the first scene, and then write the second scene, and write the third scene? And it was very mechanical, and for me it worked. That particular style worked, of approaching it that way, and in a very mechanical way. You want to get from point A to point B, and here's your general concept. And what he would say is, and this is probably a little bit blasphemous, is he would say that in the speculative fiction realm, that you're not writing literary fiction. You don't have to go that deeply into the psyches of your characters, that the story is driven primarily by the science fictional conceit, and that you can get away with, not that your characters are cardboard cutouts, but that
Mm.
you don't have to go that deeply as you would in literary fiction, and it's okay to
Well,
be more plot oriented.
yeah, I mean, was a great writer. So I don't want to criticize anything he said. However, I don't know if I agree with that particular statement. I feel like some of the best science fiction that I've read has gone really, really deeply into characterization. I'm thinking of like some of Ursula K. Le Guin's stuff.
Even in the
Yeah,
short story format, you think?
yes, yes.
Hmm.
I, there are like different modes of writing and different genres. Like, yeah, I mean, traditionally, let's say so-called hard science fiction, which I don't love the term, but I think it implies science fiction that is focused like more on the science than the character. That stuff, yeah, you could probably get away with a little bit less characterization. But I
Hmm.
really feel like, if we want to get literary on it, the interiority of the character, like what are they thinking, what are they feeling, what is their personal experience in this? That to me is I don't know. I find that extremely fascinating. Like I love the big science fictional ideas as much as anyone. I'm going for another podcast. I'm reading Rendezvous with Rama. I love the big idea of this alien spaceship that enters the solar system and they explore it and all the science behind it. That stuff is cool. But I also love the stories that go really, really deeply into character, on top of having the really cool big science fictional ideas.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you can pull off both, then
Yeah.
I'd tip my hat to if somebody can pull that off. But I think that in some ways it's almost like a, how do I put this? It's like a percentage. I think that
Mm.
if you're writing literary fiction, I think that it has to be 80% character and psychology and 20% plot. And I would say it's reversed if it's science fiction. That's just, again, my personal
Well,
opinion. If you can do both and make it, phenomenal characterization, phenomenal plotting, and dive deeply into their psyches, then hey, do it. But I think that you can, I'd say, get away, because it sounds you can get away in my opinion, less in a
yeah.
speculative fiction setting.
Well, genre fiction typically is more focused on plot. I agree with that. I agree that traditionally, but I feel that, especially with like some of the new wave science fiction, and then even today, you're seeing just a lot more um, story, like what I would consider literary quality stories about science fiction, like, or with science fictional themes or fantasy themes. And, you know, there, what I'm trying to say is I feel like there's a certain pretension among folks who read literature, capital L, that genre is somehow not literature because it's like more plot driven and it's, for juveniles or whatever, or maybe it's not as difficult to read. And I don't know, you read, yeah,
Sometimes I get frustrated when I read a literary story and the whole nothing happens really. The
yeah,
character is
it's
you
just
know,
their head.
looking out their window, or they're looking at a book, and they're, have a conversation, and you're supposed to read into the character's psychology, and there's almost no plotting. Just, somebody maybe orders takeout dinner, and then the story ends. And I'm thinking, okay, I guess it's interesting. You're getting something about, you're peeling back the layers of character through the fact they ordered this type of food, and it harkens back to a dinner they had during a romantic encounter when they were a teenager, and it's all understated, and it's all off the page in some ways, and uh, I get frustrated by the lack of plot.
Mm.
I'll confess, I'm a plot person. I love plot, and I don't. If you can pull both of those things off, that's going to be a great piece of
Yeah,
work.
so an example of a writer that's able to write science fiction but also make it quote unquote literary is Emily St. John Mandel or Mandel,
Mm.
who, Station 11
Oh,
author,
I love Station 11.
Sea of Tranquility was one, um, and I'm trying to remember her other books, but she Station 11 is just fantastic because the characterization is great, but it's also like there's a very strong science fictional conceit in there. It's a post-apocalyptic story.
Yeah, and
Canticle
by
for
the
Leibowitz is another
yes.
one, or Dune,
Oh,
right?
well,
So
Dune.
yeah,
Don't get me started on Dune.
we could have a whole podcast just on that.
Yeah, absolutely. But I, by the way, agree that the Station 11 is phenomenal. Both the book and the adaptation of it, I thought,
Yeah,
were extremely well done. But yeah, that's a really good example of somebody who's able to master both of those, plot and character. Um, so I guess the way I would summarize it is there's really no right way to write your stories. It's whatever works best for you.
yeah,
And I tend to lean more on the favor and more on the side of outlining, but I will use a hybrid approach. I think it's inevitable. You go back, you revise your outline, and then you to so that it matches what you've written in the story. Um,
yeah.
so yeah.
If I
Eh,
outline something and then I write and it diverges from the outline, I'm not revising the outline. I'm just gonna keep writing the story. I mean, because at that point I'm just like, it's extra work. Why do I, I'd rather just work on the fiction itself than the outline because it feels to me like I'm doing twice the work. I don't know. Because
It
ultimately
could
I'm lazy.
No, that's fair. That's a fair
Yeah.
point because sometimes I'll spend weeks on a one-page outline or a half a page outline
Yeah.
before I've started writing. Maybe that's my way of procrastinating. But once I've written the outline, I feel like this is really strange. The story's done.
Yeah.
It's finished, and now that that's the hard part. I've done the hard part. Now the easy part is just writing it.
Interesting.
So
For me,
I'll
it's that
promise
finish the
the
first
group
draft.
I'll promise my writing group, hey, I'll have the story next week, and I have the outline, and it's just a question of writing it.
That's pretty good. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, like you said, there is no right way to write.
Mhm.
When I first started, I would read like every writing book I could get my hands on. And some of them say this is the way you do it, with authority. And my advice would be run away from anybody who says this is the way to do it because there is no way to do it. It's whatever way works for you. And what works for me and what works for Dave may not work for you. You may have a completely different process of writing, and that's fine. And I think if you're a beginning writer, one thing to try is just to do everything. Try every method you could think of, and or that you read about or discover, and you'll find after a while what works and what doesn't. I think today for me it's kind of a hybrid. I think usually when I'm doing a short story, I have a general vision of where it wants to go and where I want to end, but I don't outline. But yeah,
Mhm.
for my last novel, I actually have to write a pitch letter for my agent for another novel, and it's like, yeah, I mean, it's not quite an outline, but it's pretty much like I have to figure out where the story's going and all the beats, etc. And yeah, it's actually quite hard because one of the joys for me in writing is a discovery, is sort of like that, you know, well, where's this going? Like I don't know where it's going to go, and just sort of following um, that flow state. I mean,
Mhm.
it's something maybe we could talk about in another podcast, but
Yeah.
the idea that like once you get into that state of writing where your subconscious is like right on the surface and it's just coming out onto the page and it's like I don't know where this is coming from, but this is fascinating. I want to just let it sort of happen and see where it goes, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. um
That's a great feeling, isn't it? When all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait a second, and the character does something, something maybe you didn't expect, and it leads to
yeah,
a complication that makes the story more interesting.
yeah, and I think that happened to us when we co-wrote our story Threat Assessment.
Yeah.
And one thing that we were talking before about Game of Thrones and the TV show when they went off book, so to speak. Um, it seems to me that when you're writing by the seat of your pants, when you're pantsing, there's more of a verisimilitude to like life, whereas when
Hmm.
you're outlining like to me, it's like sometimes when something is outlined, it's like you hit these exact beats and then the story ends on this perfect note. But life isn't so perfect and finely delineated. That life is messy and complicated and the unexpected things happen. But you also have to satisfy the reader, right? The reader is going to
Yeah.
get to the end of that story and it's got to be a satisfying note. And if you don't hit that satisfying note, you're like, well, what did
That's
I?
exactly right. That's exactly right. It's a balance, right? Because there's certain, fundamental aspects of stories that where you have to hit certain notes. There has to be a character arc, for example. Your character has to make a decision. They have to evolve, or maybe they don't evolve, but they make a decision at some point in the story. And same thing with your plot. There has to be again an arc where there's an obstacle that you have to overcome, and you either overcome it or you don't, and then there's a denouement at the end.
Yeah,
So you do have to hit those notes, and if you just writing willy nilly, you may there's a danger of not satisfying the reader. So it's a balance for
yeah.
sure. I was thinking of you mentioned Game of Thrones. What about Lost? The
Yeah,
show
I
Lost.
actually, believe it or not, have never watched the show. I
Are
think
you
I've
kidding
like
me?
absorbed it, via
It was phenomenal.
osmosis because everybody talks about it.
Wow, those first few seasons were phenomenal. I mean, and the mystery kept building and building, and these phenomenal backstories where there's flashbacks and you see the characters' lives before they reach the island. Those are my favorite episodes and the favorite aspect of those episodes for me.
So
And
this is
then
going to sound ridiculous, but somehow in my head I conflated that show with Survivor. Do you,
the reality show.
yes, and like so when people are talking about Lost in my head, I for years I was just like, oh, Survivor, and I just thought it was like a reality show, and then I realized it was fiction, but then I never kind of got over like I just thought it was really campy and like, but I no, I mean people have told me to
Oh,
watch it.
those
Yeah,
first
I
few
mean,
seasons, there's such depth to the characters,
yeah.
and the mystery keeps building and building, and then you realize, at least I did, I dropped off. It was season 4, season 5, where I realized the writers don't know where the show's
They don't know
going.
where it's going. Battlestar Galactica, the reboot, I feel like they didn't know where they were going. And then at the end, they just like, let's just shoehorn in this ridiculous explanation. And you're just like, that doesn't make sense at all. That's just like, if you thought about that for more than 15 seconds, like let's land on a planet with proto-humans. Oh, it will be fine. We'll just breed with the proto-humans. Like like what executive let that pass through, or what script director was like, yeah, no, that's totally cool. They're just gonna have sex with the proto-humans and rebuild the human race. That's totally how. Yeah, that would make
And yet,
sense.
that series again, for me, it was like superlative until the last episode or so. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
it made it
Edge of seat.
99% of the way there. You know.
Edge of seat, and it
Yeah.
again, it's because they didn't. I don't think. I mean, I don't know what the consensus is, but for me, it looked like they didn't know how it was going to end. They were just doing the Lost thing, like, oh, let's add this, and like, how are we going to end this? I don't know. And then just let's just have them land on a planet with proto-humans and breed with them.
Yeah, it
Okay,
was all it was all a dream, you
it was
know.
all a dream, right? All
Oh
right.
my.
Well, we're
Well,
coming up on about 45 minutes here. So, any final thoughts on pantsing versus plotting?
my only final point is that before we started this podcast,
Yeah,
I prepared an outline,
you did.
and I don't know if you're aware of this, but we've hit all the points. I'm not
Uh-oh.
sure, we bobbed and we weaved, and I'm not sure that I'm satisfied with how it turned out, but
Did we
but
land
but
it? Did we
but
nail the
we're at the
ending?
end. We're at the end, at least. I think we nailed the ending, so that's fine. That's my
Yeah.
final thought.
Yes. I don't know if I have any final thoughts. I think I'm gonna just fade out like a film noir at the end. Um,
Nice.
yeah. Speaking of film noir, um, no spoilers. Watch the show Sugar on Apple TV. Totally, you're gonna love it. I think it's awesome.
What's the premise? I haven't heard of that one.
Trying not to say too much. All right, let me just. It is a Colin Farrell is a private detective in LA who is hired by a very rich director who's sort of Scorsese-like, and he has a dysfunctional family, and he's hired to find his missing granddaughter, who has been known to be a drug addict, and the family is convinced, oh, she's just on another bender, but the grandfather's like, no, it's different this time. So Colin Farrell gets obsessed with finding her, and
Ah.
and he's obsessed with like film noir movies. So like
Hmm.
there's film noir clips like edited throughout. If you ever seen the TV show Herman's Head from the 90s,
I do remember that.
you
Yes,
know where
yes.
he would always like have these clips in his head when someone spoke that it
Yeah.
reminded me. It's sort of like that where he's going through, but it took me a little while to get into because it has a unique uh visual style that there's like, and there's a couple mysteries in there that I think you'll really like.
All right, I'm gonna definitely check that out.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So I guess that we'll wrap it up there.
Yeah, so Dave, if people want to find more of your stuff, where can they look and where can they find us?
Good question. I mean, you can go out hunting because no, you can find me on Facebook, David Mercurio Rivera, and on Twitter, Mercurio Rivera is my handle. And you can just Google me. You can find my website, Mercurio Rivera.
I think it's
Is that right?
mercuriodrivera.com, right? Or
No,
is it?
Mercurio D Rivera. You're right, MercurioDRivera.com. Jesus Christ, I don't know my own website.
You need to outline this shit, Dave.
I do. I need to sit down and outline these things.
Yeah.
How about you? Where can we find your things?
My website's matthewkressel.net. I'm, on Blue Sky, Twitter. Well, is it X? I don't really use it anymore. Facebook, sometimes Instagram. And yeah, I have a newsletter at outerdeep.substack.com. Or if you just go to my website, you can see I have 2 different newsletters. But
catch if you definitely pick up Dispatches from the Outer Deep, which is Matt's new writing guide, which talks about pantsing and plotting and lots of other good stuff.
Yes, thank you.
So
And
we'll be back soon to talk about what's our next topic, Matt?
that's a good question. We'll have to figure it out.
Yes.
We'll have to outline it. But if anybody listening out there has any questions or wants to talk more about pantsing versus plotting, give us a poke online, and we'll be happy to talk about it. So yeah, this was a lot of fun.
All right. So
All
we'll
right.
be back soon, folks.
All right. See you next time. All
Bye-bye.
right. Bye.
You have been listening to the Nerd Count Podcast. That's our show. But if you want more shows, check us out at nerdcountpodcast.com or your favorite podcasting site. See you next time.
Get those nerds! Nerds! Nerds!